They say your engagement party should be one of the happiest days of your life, but mine started with my parents laughing in my face. My name is Nicole, and that night, I stood in the center of a beautifully decorated hall, dressed in a soft blush gown I had picked out alone, my hands slightly trembling, not from nerves, but from the weight of years of being underestimated. My parents were there, seated comfortably at the front with my extended family, smirking as they exchanged whispers. I knew those looks. The ones that say, "She's delusional again." The ones that sting more than words. You see, I told them I was engaged, and they didn't believe me. Not because I was dishonest, but because, to them, I was invisible. I had made the mistake of sending them a simple card instead of groveling for their blessing, and now they thought it was a prank. They called my fiancé Mr. Invisible. My mother joked loudly enough for others to hear, "Maybe he's a spy, so secret even she hasn't met him." Laughter erupted from their table. My chest tightened. I scanned the room, hoping for a distraction. Guests murmured. Some gave me pitying looks, others amused ones. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just stood still, smiling softly. The music played, the food was untouched, and I waited because I knew something they didn't. My father raised a glass. To Nicole and her imaginary man. May she find someone real one day. The entire room broke into uneasy laughter. A few friends looked mortified, but no one said anything. Just as I opened my mouth to speak, not to defend myself, but maybe to quietly excuse myself, a low rumble shook the air. People looked around, confused. The laughter died. That's when we heard it. The unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Chairs scraped back. People ran to the windows. A sudden gust of wind blew in as the doors burst open. And there, walking through the chaos like a scene out of a movie, was Adam. Sharp black suit, windswept hair, and a look in his eyes that went straight to my soul. He stopped just short of me, gave me that familiar half-smile, and said, "Sorry I'm late, dear." Traffic in the sky was terrible. Silence. Dead. Stunned. Silence. My mother's face turned the shade of milk. My father's jaw hung open. All those who had laughed stared in wide-eyed disbelief as Adam leaned in and kissed my hand like I was royalty. He turned to the room. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate our engagement." Nobody clapped. They couldn't. They were too busy choking on the pride they'd swallowed their whole lives. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't look at my parents. I simply smiled at Adam and whispered, "You're right on time." I finally felt seen. Not because of the helicopter. Not because of the shock value. But because I had stayed silent through all their noise, and in the end, the silence spoke louder than any scream. Long before the helicopter blades cut through the air, before the silence at the engagement party made the earth feel like it shifted, there were years of quiet tears, invisible bruises, and a constant ache in my chest that came from being the lesser daughter. My parents didn't hate me, they simply never saw me. That was the root of everything. I wasn't the beautiful one. I wasn't the talented one. I wasn't the one they paraded around at dinners or gushed over to family friends. That was my sister, Claire. Claire had always shined, and I had always been her shadow. When we were kids, she won spelling bees, dance medals, and hearts. I brought home art projects and small victories from school, only to be met with distracted nods or the infamous, "That's nice, Nicole." On my 13th birthday, I remember giving my mother a handmade bracelet. She smiled, placed it on the kitchen counter, and went back to watching Claire twirl in her new ballet outfit. She never wore it. I found it a week later at the bottom of a drawer full of batteries and old receipts. It wasn't just the little things. It was the way my father introduced me to people. "This is Claire," he'd say with a beaming grin. Then, gesturing to me like an afterthought, "And this is, the quiet one." The quiet one. It wasn't meant to hurt, but it stayed with me like a birthmark. At every gathering, I became the one who fetched drinks, who cleaned up plates, who disappeared into the background so Claire's spotlight wouldn't be disrupted. Even in adulthood, the pattern continued. Claire got into a big university. I got a scholarship to a smaller school, and when I told them, they said, "That's good, too. Not we're proud of you, not you worked so hard." Just too, like my life was a cheap imitation of hers. They didn't attend my graduation. They were on a cruise with Claire and her boyfriend. When I got my first job, they asked, "Will you be able to keep up?" When I got promoted, they didn't ask what I did, they asked if it meant I'd finally move out of my shared apartment. Every success was minimized. Every milestone was a footnote. But the worst moment, the one that carved itself into me like glass, was the day I told them I was in love. It had taken everything in me to say it. We were having dinner at a restaurant Claire had picked. She and my parents were talking about her upcoming trip to Europe, and I sat quietly, watching them laugh. Then I said, "I've met someone." They paused. Then, as if on cue, they laughed. My father asked, "What's his name?" "Mr. Online?" Claire added, "Do you mean the guy who delivers your groceries?" I tried to explain that Adam was real. That he was kind, brilliant, and everything I had dreamed of. But their ears were closed. Their minds made up. They didn't believe I could be loved like that. They didn't think I was worth it. That night, I went home and cried quietly in the bathroom. Adam called, and I told him everything. He didn't speak for a moment, then said, "Let them laugh now. One day, they won't know what hit them." I didn't know then what he meant. But I remembered every wound they gave me, every sarcastic chuckle, every time I was overlooked, every celebration they skipped. And I kept it all inside, not with hatred, but with something colder, something sharper, silence. The kind of silence that waits. And then strikes when the time is right. I remember the night I finally decided to make the announcement at the engagement party. It was a moment that had been long overdue, but the anticipation, the fear, the thrill of finally standing up to my parents, all of it had me feeling both powerful and vulnerable. It wasn't the grand party I had envisioned as a little girl. There were no shimmering lights, no extravagant decorations. The room was filled with the same faces that had always been a part of our life, family friends who saw me as the quiet one, the girl who didn't have much to say. But this time, I was prepared to change that. To make them see me, truly see me. The plan had been simple: I would announce my engagement, and I would introduce my imaginary groom, Adam, whom they had never met. And it was no coincidence that I chose this moment. The first step toward my silent revenge was to take control of the narrative. I was done being overlooked, done being the joke. I had rehearsed the words, but nothing could prepare me for the moment I saw them. My parents, laughing and chatting as though everything was normal, their eyes not even noticing me at first. Claire, of course, was the center of attention, as always, with her perfect smile and her sparkling engagement ring. She had been engaged for months, but her excitement still shone through, as if the world revolved around her. That's when I decided to speak up. "Actually," I said, standing from my seat. All eyes turned toward me, some out of curiosity, others in mild confusion. "I have something to announce." My voice was steady, calm, far different from the trembling girl I used to be. This time, I wasn't asking for approval. I didn't need it. I didn't care if they laughed or dismissed me again. This was my moment. "I'm engaged too," I said, trying to ignore the flicker of surprise in their eyes. My parents exchanged a glance. My mother raised an eyebrow. "Really?" she asked in that familiar, condescending tone. "To who, exactly? Another online dreamboat?" The laughter around the room wasn't the kind I had imagined. It wasn't genuine or warm. It was a sharp, biting laugh, mocking, ridiculing. And then, with a voice that was louder than I'd ever intended, I added, "His name is Adam. And he's here." There was a pause, a moment of silence where the entire room seemed to hold its breath. And then, as if the universe had orchestrated it, the sound of helicopter blades whirring overhead broke through the tension. It was faint at first, a distant hum, but growing louder with each passing second. My parents' eyes darted to each other, confusion painting their faces. Was this some sort of joke? Was I seriously pulling this stunt to get attention? But I didn't waver. I didn't flinch. My heart beat a little faster, but I held myself firm. The helicopter hovered for a moment, and then it began to descend, the air vibrating around us as it touched down near the entrance of the venue. I watched their faces, their eyes narrowing in disbelief. This wasn't part of the plan they had in their minds. This wasn't something they could control. The door to the helicopter opened. A tall, broad figure emerged from the cockpit, a man dressed in a sharp suit. He was a perfect contrast to the scruffy image my parents had imagined for my fiancé. Adam looked nothing like what they expected, a mere fantasy conjured up by a lonely daughter. He was everything I had always dreamed of, calm, collected, successful. He adjusted his tie as he stepped onto the grass, walked toward the entrance, and with a grin, he looked directly at me. "Sorry I'm late, dear," he said in a voice that was deep, confident, and completely unbothered by the spectacle. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, but I wasn't looking at them anymore. I was only focused on Adam, and how, for the first time in my life, everything had come full circle. I had been ridiculed for loving someone they couldn't even imagine. But now, he was standing in front of them, the living proof of everything I had endured in silence. My parents looked frozen, their faces pale as they tried to comprehend the situation. My mother's mouth hung open, but no words came out. My father's face had turned from disbelief to something darker, a recognition that they had underestimated me, dismissed me, and, in doing so, had driven me to this moment. I stood there, watching them, but saying nothing. The silence was louder than any words I could have spoken. As Adam stepped forward, the room seemed to close in on me. The air felt thicker, and I could hear the sounds of the chattering guests slowly fade into the background, as though their voices were muffled by the weight of what was happening. Every eye in the room was on us. My parents, my relatives, all the people who had looked down on me, now saw what they had so effortlessly dismissed. Adam's presence wasn't just the grand entrance. It was the truth standing there in front of them, and it was a truth that no one could deny. He had everything that they'd told me I needed to find: status, success, charm. He wasn't some imaginary boyfriend I'd conjured up to escape the loneliness of my life. He was real, and he was more than capable of standing in front of the people who had never taken me seriously. But the silence between my parents and me wasn't as victorious as I thought it would be. It was heavy. My mother's face twisted with disbelief and embarrassment. She had always been the one to ridicule my choices, belittle my dreams, and treat me as though I was forever chasing unattainable fantasies. I had expected her reaction, but seeing it in real time made me feel something I couldn't fully process: regret? No, it wasn't regret. It was something far more powerful: liberation. Adam walked toward me, taking my hand with a smile that held the weight of unspoken promises. My mother's eyes flicked between us, and I could feel her trying to piece together the puzzle that had shattered in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The shock was too much for her to handle. I didn't need to say anything. I knew that. I'd spent my life waiting for the validation of my parents, hoping one day they would see me for who I truly was. But now, standing here in front of them with Adam by my side, I realized that their approval didn't matter anymore. The awkwardness of the moment grew, and I could sense the crowd shifting uncomfortably. This was no longer about a simple engagement announcement, it was a lesson they hadn't planned for, and they didn't know how to handle it. My father, finally able to find his voice, let out a strained chuckle. It was a weak attempt at regaining control of the situation. "You really thought this was going to work?" he asked, his words dripping with scorn. "You think you can just waltz in here and present this show of yours and expect us to believe it?" I could see the disgust in his eyes, a familiar look I had seen so many times growing up. It wasn't new. My father had always dismissed my dreams, dismissed me, in favor of his expectations, and the bitter sting of his judgment was something I had grown accustomed to. But this time, I wasn't flinching. I didn't feel the need to explain myself or beg for their approval. The woman who had stood before them all her life, meek and begging for recognition, was no longer the same person. I simply squeezed Adam's hand, steady and sure, as he responded calmly. "You may not believe it, but I'm here, and I care for your daughter deeply." His voice was firm but not forceful. It wasn't meant to provoke or escalate. It was just a statement of fact. And, for once, it felt like the truth. The tension in the air thickened, as if everyone were waiting for some sort of confrontation to explode, but it didn't come. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a loud, angry fight. I had lived through enough years of that, and I was done with it. Instead, I let the silence speak for itself. My father's face hardened, his jaw clenching as if he were holding back the words he desperately wanted to say. But there was something in his expression, something about the way his eyes shifted from anger to a dawning realization, that made me realize this wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about my engagement. It was about everything he had dismissed in my life, everything he had underestimated about me. They had spent so long mocking me, laughing at me behind closed doors, convincing themselves that I would always be the weak, quiet daughter. They had no idea that all those years of silence had been me building something stronger than they could ever have imagined, my own strength, my own sense of self. I didn't need to say a word. The quiet defiance, the dignified silence, was my statement. And in that silence, I watched as my father's expression shifted, slowly, uncomfortably, as though he were finally seeing me for the first time. But it was too late. The truth of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. The room was still, suspended in time. My parents stood there, frozen, their expressions a blend of disbelief, frustration, and something else, a fleeting recognition of the consequences of their years of neglect. I could feel the weight of their gaze, and it stung more than I wanted to admit. They were silent now, no longer making their usual cutting remarks, no longer pretending they were above me. The charade had ended, and we were left standing in the wake of their disillusionment. Adam, ever the steady presence by my side, didn't move. He didn't say anything further. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. As he stood with me, I could almost sense the ripple of tension running through the crowd. They had come here expecting a simple announcement, maybe even some drama to entertain them, but instead, they had witnessed something far more powerful, something that no amount of family dynamics could take away. I turned my attention back to my parents. My mother's face had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with her drink. She looked as though she had seen a ghost, and perhaps, in a way, she had. The daughter she had so easily dismissed and belittled over the years was no longer the same person. I had become someone unrecognizable to her, strong, unapologetic, and willing to stand in front of the people who had once controlled my every move. I had expected anger from her, expected her to lash out and try to put me in my place as she had done countless times before. But instead, there was something closer to regret in her eyes, something deeper that I hadn't anticipated. She wasn't angry at me anymore, she was angry at herself, for the years she had spent trying to make me fit into a mold that never suited me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to her. I didn't need to justify my choices or my engagement to her. It wasn't about her approval. It was about me finally stepping into the woman I had always been, regardless of whether or not she saw it. I had been the quiet daughter, the one who lived in the shadow of their expectations. But no more. And then there was my father, his face a storm of emotions. He was silent, his jaw clenched as he looked at Adam, then back at me. I could see the struggle in his eyes. He had always been the one who held the power, the one who made the rules. But now, I was no longer playing by those rules. My life, my decisions, my happiness, none of it had anything to do with him anymore. I had taken control, and that realization seemed to terrify him. It was in that moment, as I watched my father's face contort with the emotion he couldn't voice, that I realized something profound. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need him to validate my choices. What I needed was this quiet, dignified silence that spoke volumes, that sent a clear message without a single harsh word being exchanged. I had finally learned how to stand up for myself, not through confrontation or anger, but through the power of simply existing as I was. The tension in the room continued to simmer, but it wasn't the kind of tension that led to chaos. It was the kind of tension that left people questioning their own beliefs, their own judgments. And that, in its own way, was far more powerful than any explosive outburst could have been. I glanced around the room, catching the eyes of a few relatives who had always sided with my parents, and I saw something there, something I hadn't seen before. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was something akin to respect. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they saw me differently now. And that feeling of being seen, truly seen, was all I needed. Adam squeezed my hand once again, his touch reassuring, his presence grounding. I didn't need to say anything to him. He had been here for me in ways no one else had, and his support was the most important thing in this moment. But even as I stood there with Adam by my side, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling deep inside. Was this truly over? Had I finally severed the ties with my parents, or was this just another chapter in an ongoing cycle? The truth was, I wasn't sure. I didn't know if this was the end of our story or just the beginning. But I did know one thing: I had taken the first step toward freedom, toward self-respect, and that felt like victory enough. As the room slowly came to life again, I didn't wait for anyone to say anything more. I simply turned and walked away from the tense atmosphere, leading Adam toward the exit. We didn't need to be a part of the circus anymore. I had my own life to live, and I wasn't going to waste it waiting for approval from people who never cared to understand me. The car ride away from the venue was oddly calm. The world outside seemed to blur as the soft hum of the engine filled the space between Adam and me. I couldn't help but reflect on the moments that had just transpired, the impact of what had just happened still settling inside me. It was strange, this feeling of quiet victory. For years, I had waited for the right moment to stand up to my parents, but when it finally came, it wasn't in the form of an explosive confrontation. It wasn't in shouting or demanding an apology. It came in the form of simply existing, of refusing to be invisible anymore. As I sat in the passenger seat, staring out of the window, my mind kept replaying the moments from the party, the expressions on my parents' faces when Adam had arrived. There had been no need for harsh words. No need for me to try and prove anything. The look of shock on my mother's face, the silent struggle I saw in my father's eyes, it had all been enough to show them that I was no longer the same person they could control with their judgments and expectations. I turned to Adam, his eyes focused on the road ahead. He had been my rock, the steady hand that had supported me through it all. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for him. He had stood by me not just today, but through all the years of self-doubt, through every moment where I wondered if I would ever be enough for my parents, for anyone. Adam had always seen me for who I truly was, not the person my family wanted me to be. "You're quiet," he said gently, breaking the silence. "How are you feeling?" I looked at him, offering a soft smile. "Relieved," I replied, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotion still swirling inside me. Relief that I finally did it, that I stood up for myself without needing to scream or fight. He nodded, his expression understanding. It takes more strength to walk away from the fight than to engage in it. You did the right thing. I looked out the window again, the streets passing by as I thought about his words. How many times had I tried to please them? How many years had I sacrificed my own happiness, my own desires, just to win their approval? And for what? For a moment's fleeting praise, only to be forgotten the second I didn't meet their expectations? It was a bitter realization, but it was the truth. My parents had never really seen me. Not truly. They had seen an image of who they wanted me to be, perfect, obedient, silent, and they had tried to mold me into that image for so long. But that wasn't who I was. I was someone else now. Someone stronger. Someone who had learned to choose herself, to refuse to play the role they had assigned me. And as painful as that had been, it was the most liberating choice I had ever made. Adam took a turn, and we were soon on the outskirts of the city, the lights of the party now a distant memory. I could feel the tension in my body slowly fading, replaced by a quiet peace. It wasn't that everything was magically fixed. It wasn't that my relationship with my parents had been instantly repaired. But it was the first step. The first step toward reclaiming my life, my happiness, and my sense of self-worth. "We have each other," Adam said, his voice soft but firm. "That's all that matters. The rest of them, they'll have to deal with their own choices." I felt a surge of warmth flood through me as I reached out to squeeze his hand. He was right. For so long, I had been focused on what my parents thought, on what they expected. But now, I was free to live for myself. To build a future that didn't depend on their validation. To create a life that was mine, one where I could be loved, accepted, and cherished simply for being who I was. The car was quiet again, but this time, it felt peaceful. It felt like the calm after a storm, like everything had finally settled into place. I wasn't broken anymore. I wasn't the girl they had tried to break. I was stronger than I had ever been, and I was ready to face whatever came next. I had learned the most important lesson of all, that my happiness didn't lie in their approval, and it never had. We were almost home now, and I could see the lights of our little house glowing in the distance. My heart swelled with a sense of contentment I had never known before. The battle wasn't over, but I had already won. And that, I realized, was all I needed. The next morning, the weight of the previous night's events settled in slowly. I woke up, not to the frantic rush of emotions that had plagued me before, but with a sense of clarity that felt almost foreign. The silence in the house was peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled my life for so long. Adam was already awake, working on his laptop at the kitchen table. He looked up when I walked in, offering a soft smile that seemed to ground me in this newfound reality. "Morning," he greeted me gently. "How are you feeling today?" I paused for a moment, considering the question. "I think I'm finally seeing things clearly," I said, my voice steady. "Last night, I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I don't need their approval. I don't need to prove anything to them." Adam nodded, setting aside his laptop to give me his full attention. "That's huge. But it's not easy, is it?" I shook my head, the truth of it sinking in even more deeply now. "No, it's not. For years, I've been so focused on earning their love, trying to get them to see me as I am, but it never worked. They couldn't see me because they were too busy trying to mold me into their idea of who I should be. The realization was a painful one. My parents had always seen me as a project, an extension of their own desires and dreams, rather than as an individual with my own wants and needs. They had loved me, yes, but only in the way that suited them. I wasn't allowed to be flawed, to be imperfect, to be different from what they had envisioned. As I sat across from Adam, I found myself recalling moments from my childhood, moments where I had tried to fit into their expectations. I remembered the times I had bent myself in every direction to make them happy, pushing aside my own desires, my own dreams, to align with what they thought was best. I thought about the countless times I had been praised for my achievements, only to feel empty inside, knowing that I wasn't truly being seen for who I was. But the flashbacks weren't painful anymore. They were just memories, lessons learned. They were part of my story, but they no longer defined me. "I've spent so much of my life trying to make them happy," I said, my voice quiet but resolute. But in doing so, I lost myself. I lost my sense of who I am. Adam reached across the table and took my hand in his. "And now you're finding yourself again. That's all that matters." The words sank in, a profound sense of peace washing over me as I thought about how far I had come. Last night, I had not only stood up to my parents, but I had also stood up for myself. I had chosen to live for me, not for their approval, not for their expectations. But as much as I had grown, I knew that there was still one final piece to the puzzle, one final step I needed to take to solidify my peace. It wasn't enough to just walk away from them, to sever the ties that had bound me for so long. I had to let go, truly and completely, of the guilt that had kept me chained to their expectations. I had to forgive myself. It wasn't about forgiving them, at least not yet. They had their own journey to go on, their own reckoning to face. But I had to forgive myself for the years I had spent living for their approval, for the part of me that had been complicit in the cycle of toxicity. I had to stop blaming myself for their failures as parents, for the ways they had tried to control me. In the silence of the kitchen, I took a deep breath and made a promise to myself. I would never again let their opinions dictate my worth. I would never again shrink into the background of my own life, hoping for their validation. I was worthy, just as I was. The rest of the morning passed in a blur, and before long, the sun had set. We had gone about our day, running errands and taking time for ourselves, but in the back of my mind, I knew something important was still waiting to happen. My parents had to confront the truth of their actions. They had to face the consequences of their words and their expectations. That evening, as we sat on the couch together, the phone rang. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the name on the screen, my mother. I took a deep breath before answering, bracing myself for whatever she would say. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. Are you okay?" My mother's voice trembled on the other end. There was a pause before she added, "We've been thinking about last night, and we want to apologize." The words were barely out before I felt a surge of anger and hurt rise within me. But I stopped myself. I didn't need to react. I didn't need to lash out. This moment was mine to control, not hers. "I'm fine," I said, my voice calm. "But I think it's too late for an apology. I've already made my peace." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. My mother, for once, had no words. And with that, I ended the call, not with anger, but with a quiet sense of satisfaction. I had done it. I had finally taken control of my own life, and nothing could take that away from me. The days that followed felt surreal. For the first time in my life, I woke up without the heavy weight of my parents' expectations looming over me. The phone call with my mother had been the final step in a journey I had started without even knowing it, a journey toward self-discovery and freedom. Adam and I spent our days planning for the future, building our life together. His presence had been a grounding force through all the chaos, but it was my own inner strength that had carried me to this point. I was no longer the girl who had hidden in the shadows of others' lives, hoping to be seen, to be accepted. I was a woman who had chosen herself, for the first time ever. There were moments when the guilt crept back in, of course. The echoes of my mother's voice, the lingering sense of disappointment from my father, would occasionally stir within me. But each time, I reminded myself of why I had made this choice. It wasn't about rejecting them, it was about accepting myself. I had spent too many years trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine, and now, I was free to live as my true self. One evening, as Adam and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset, I reflected on everything that had led me here. The pain of my childhood, the constant feeling of being unworthy, the frustration of never being enough for my parents, it all seemed like a distant memory now. I had let go of that burden, and in doing so, I had found peace. But there was something more. There was a deeper sense of satisfaction that came from knowing I had been true to myself. I had endured the years of silence, the years of being invisible, and now, I was standing tall. My parents might never understand, and that was okay. They might never see the woman I had become, but that was no longer my concern. I had found my voice, and I was using it to speak for myself, not for their approval. As I sat there, feeling the cool breeze brush against my skin, I thought back to the moment when Adam had arrived in the helicopter, when everything had shifted. It had been the ultimate moment of clarity, the final punctuation in a sentence that had been years in the making. My parents had been shocked, yes, but it was not their shock that mattered. It was my liberation that had been the real turning point. "Do you ever think about them?" Adam asked, breaking me out of my reverie. I turned to him, smiling softly. "Sometimes. But only in passing. I think about the girl I used to be, the one who thought she had to live for them. And I feel proud of her for making it through." Adam nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "You're a strong woman, Nicole. I'm proud of you." Those words, simple yet profound, resonated deep within me. I had spent so much time looking for validation from my parents, from others. But now, I realized that the only validation I truly needed was my own. And for the first time in my life, I was proud of who I was becoming. The phone never rang again. My parents had tried to reach out once more, but I ignored their calls. It wasn't out of anger or resentment, but because I no longer needed their approval. I had moved on, and so had they. Our paths had diverged, and that was just the way life worked sometimes. Months passed, and slowly but surely, the peace I had fought so hard for settled into my life. Adam and I continued to build our future, and I found joy in the simple things, quiet mornings, spontaneous adventures, and most importantly, the freedom to be myself without fear of judgment. I had learned that peace didn't come from the approval of others, but from within. And though my parents had never truly apologized, I realized something crucial. Their failure to understand me wasn't my burden to carry anymore. The silence I had given them was the most dignified form of revenge I could have chosen. It wasn't about getting back at them, it was about letting go of the power they had once held over me. As time went on, I finally embraced the truth that had been slowly forming in my heart: I wasn't broken. I was whole. I had just needed to see it for myself. I had spent so many years looking for validation in the wrong places, seeking approval from people who would never truly see me. But now, I had learned the most important lesson of all: the only approval I needed was my own. And with that, I knew that my life had finally begun.